Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. It is Monday, October 4th. I'm Rob Fowler with SBAM, the CEO, and Brian Calley, the president of SBAM, is the co-host. And this briefing is brought to you by Marana Group, a data documents and distribution solutions company. Brian, I don't know if you know this, but according to the census, nearly 15.3 million American households move each year, which makes it difficult to keep a marketing list. And Marana Group actually has a solution for that. They help keep marketing lists and addresses up to date. You can find out more at maranagroup.com. Brian, I don't even know who's listening as we speak right now. Facebook is apparently down as we start this briefing. And so I think it'll go, we'll push it out on Facebook when Facebook comes back. In the meantime, I know we got some Zoom followers and listeners, so we'll talk to them for the time being. That's kind of a weird time.
Yeah, Facebook's down all over the place, so that's where the main audience for this comes from. But yeah, we'll make sure to once it's all back up, we're recording this and we'll put it right out.
All right. Well, today is, anybody who's been watching this briefing knows what we refer to as Data Monday. And I thought maybe we'd start with just a little bit of context. I mean, we don't do Data Monday because we're data geeks. Well, maybe you are a little bit, but the main reason, and the reason we started it was we were watching the same data that the governor was seeing. It really was the information that drove decision-making. And it's become really, I think we've all become familiar with the data and the patterns of the data. This morning in the New York Times, there was an article, it was entitled, "COVID is in Retreat." And it really talked about this idea that they're just 2-month waves or 2.5-month waves. And I think if we look back and as we look at some of the data today, we might want to keep that in mind. It sort of suggests that these waves come almost regardless of all the things we have thought about climate, indoor people being indoors or outdoors, social distancing, mask policy. The one thing that seems to really be associated with the mitigation is vaccines. With that kind of as a backdrop, and then some discussion about this afterwards, let's take a look at the data.
Yeah, so in looking at the data this week, it's even though Michigan's numbers aren't quite going down yet, it's been kind of a bit of an enigma, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the country as a whole certainly is. So, by the way, I do have, I'll just give credit here to the business leaders for Michigan on these slides. So every other week or so, sometimes not quite that frequently, I'll get the analysis that comes with their data and slides, and like to share them with our audience because I think they do just a really nice job at digging into these. So here you see the U.S. and the EU. The EU has kind of plateaued at about 100 cases per million, but the U.S. has hit a peak and has started its descent. And so, if you notice this, so you talked about that 2 months, at July, August to the beginning of September, and that's when you saw the country start to came down pretty sharply. This is a lot lower than the height of the pandemic and the previous wave around the country. So as we look at how things looked in August and how they look in September around the country, you'll see that the darker shades where there's more COVID, it's kind of moved across the country. and so you see, excuse me, Michigan is moved up 27th in the country, so still middle of the pack, but it wasn't too long ago. Excuse me, frog in my throat here. It wasn't too long ago that you saw COVID, or that you saw Michigan at the very bottom in the whole country. So that's not the case at the moment, and but still pretty moderate. But the difference is the trend that we'll see in Michigan compared to other places around the country. So you see in the South, the numbers went up. Now they come down pretty sharply. And you'll see Michigan, where Michigan is that dark line that goes across all three of these areas. And then if you look at our neighbors, Ohio, Indiana, and then also Tennessee, which had gotten quite high, their numbers are sharply falling. All of those still a bit over Michigan's numbers. But if you look at ours, you see ours are actually still going up. So as of actually this is from late last week. So you see at 3,500, the Friday numbers are a little higher than this. But as of Monday, numbers that come out just a little while ago, Michigan's were a little bit lower. So it would be time for that to happen, right? It would be just about time for Michigan's numbers to start going down, because they go up for a couple of months, then they go down. And this is about half as much as before. And if you look at the consequences to these waves, you see that that also looks smaller. Actually, before we get to that, the positivity rate. We don't talk a lot about the positivity rate now because the testing volume is so, it fluctuates so greatly that that the percent positive, until their testing ramps up, it doesn't tell you as much. But now it is plateauing, which is a pretty good sign. The numbers are going to plateau and start to come down. So then looking at hospitalization, this is one of my favorite slides, because you see that this wave looks very, very different than before. Before, the hospitalizations had gotten up to over 4,000. This time, while again, they're still going up, but going up very slowly, that don't look like they'll even come close to what they were before. And then with mortality, the same thing. You see this progressively getting smaller. That's about both natural immunity and also the vaccines, especially among the older population. So a while ago, we looked at a couple of different projections, and the one that looked most likely was this green bar that you see, that would have, by now started going up more exponentially. That never happened. The numbers just kind of still going up, but going up much slower, looking much flatter than what you would have expected based on the way previous waves had behaved. Now, why would that be? It could be, this is one possible explanation. If you look at what happened in Michigan last spring with the alpha wave, it's way, way higher than all of the other Midwestern states. They all had little waves. We had a big one. There is some data to suggest that antibodies from infections from the alpha wave are very effective with fending off the Delta variant. And so you see Michigan's down here. Michigan didn't get as high as other states in the Midwest during this particular wave. So one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is that this rise that we experienced for the first couple months was really just getting up to kind of the Delta plateau level, which would have been higher than what we had last summer with the original strain. And then maybe we still have a winter spike in our future. Michigan's numbers are behaving differently than almost anywhere in the country, and it makes it much more difficult to predict what's going to happen next. But just looking at the predictability and the number of weeks that goes up, Michigan should be at a point where it's plateauing and starting to decline. It's just suspect because it never got that high, including compared to places like Ohio and Indiana that were right next to us. So a little bit kind of, a little skeptical that we're through this, and then the number's going to drop that back down very low, but hopeful. It certainly looks possible, and if you count out the weeks, it should be happening now. So we'll see in next week, but today's numbers looked good, and hopefully that means that we'll be back in a declining and lower risk environment here real soon.
So I raised this issue of this New York Times article, and partly because it ended with I don't know, provocative sort of opinion. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who was the commissioner of the FDA formerly, new book out. But he says that it is his opinion that this is the last major wave of COVID. That the country has reached a point of 76% of nationally of 12 or older who are eligible have gotten the vaccine, and it's his belief that this may be the last one. And I mean, since we started talking about this, I don't know that anybody's dared to say this is the last one. I think maybe the first one we thought was the last one. We thought there was a wave. We didn't understand waves at that point.
Yeah, and you can see it happening in terms of the severity, the outcomes lessening. So you remember Michigan's, wave with mortality. A lot of people lost their lives early, and then the next major wave, it was smaller, and then this one looks smaller still. And I think it's reasonable to believe that this is turning into something that is less of an emergency and more of just an ongoing illness. And viruses and infections spread across the globe regularly and don't wreak the kind of havoc that COVID-19 did in the last 18 months. So there is a and it's like a knock on wood thing. That I think people are a little bit shy now to kind of directly proclaim, because we've been surprised before in the last 18 months, but there is a growing undercurrent of belief that the toughest scenario, the toughest times are behind us. Now, but I think there's a big caveat to that, and that is that the places that haven't experienced big waves like Michigan and other states here could still have some tough times. If you look at Alaska, for example, right now, the geographic isolation of Alaska has protected it until the Delta variant, which is way more infectious than previous strains. And so you see now a lot of problems with the healthcare system being big enough to handle what's happening in Alaska today. Michigan, though, thankfully, and hopefully that those days are behind us, because there is, between vaccine immunity and natural immunity in the population, filling up hospitals to the brim like happened before seems a lot less likely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me just ask you the question. We watch all this because it gives us a sense of what our government is likely to do. You see any scenario where we go back to restrictions, lockdowns, further mandates?
I don't. In fact, the state's reluctance to even issue some sort of a rule or set of mandates on schools is a good indication that the state is not planning on doing anything of that nature. So there's this question of federal, the federal OSHA, and if federal OSHA does something, then the state is either the state OSHA department has to do it, or the federal department, or they lose their ability to act on behalf of OSHA, and the feds do it. But there's that thing swirling out there. But absent a federal mandate coming down to the state, I don't really see them doing anything that looks remotely like before. I think if I would take it to be a signal if the governor were to issue rules that schools had to follow as opposed to guidelines. I'd look at that as, okay, the possibility of more mandates for workplaces would go up in that scenario. But as far as I'm concerned, if they haven't done it in schools, then it's not something that I think is very likely to happen in workplaces. Again, in terms of mandates, there's going to be recommendations, there's going to be guidelines, and in terms of dealing with OSHA, I think the same recommendation stands, which is that if one of your employees complains and they come and do an investigation, their test on, are you meeting the general duty obligation to provide an environment free from recognized hazards, and COVID is a recognized hazard. The only answer that I could see that would put you at risk is if they say, hey, what are you doing to mitigate risk of COVID in your environment? If your answer is nothing, I think that you could possibly get a ticket. If your answer is not nothing, doing something, that you're probably in pretty good shape.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was going to ask you a little bit later in the briefing if we're seeing anything. The Biden administration has talked about a vaccine mandate for employers over 100. So while we're on this topic, you hear anything from Washington OSHA would guide Michigan OSHA to do something about it?
Crickets so far. Now, this is one you might remember several weeks back when this first came out, and they said, well, within a month, we'll have the rules out. And I was pretty skeptical because there are so many very, very difficult details, other than just the general reluctance that, of course, most small business owners would have. Because keep in mind that it's employers over 100, but it's also anybody that accepts Medicare or Medicaid. A lot, look at our membership. We have hundreds of members who have fewer than 100 employees, but they accept Medicare and Medicaid payments because they're in the medical industry. And this, as the way they describe this mandate, it will apply to them too. So there's naturally a reluctance to it. I was pretty skeptical that they were gonna be able to figure all those details out anytime soon. So far, nothing. I haven't picked up on any kind of instructions or kind of get ready and something's coming from the feds to the state. Nothing yet. So I don't know whether or not this will be like the last time. Remember in the last spring or in the winter, the White House said to OSHA, come out with nationwide rules, and then they're on again, off again, on again, off again, and then finally they just came out with guidance, and there were actually no rules that were issued. Maybe this will be that type of case. They said they were going to do it, and then later on they make the decision not to.
Yeah. All right, let's turn our attention to what's happening in Washington. We've been paying attention to the infrastructure bill and the human infrastructure bill. I'll put it that way. The $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that's largely bipartisan, and the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better package. And just the sort of, I think when we had the briefing on Thursday, we thought maybe by the time Monday rolled around, one of those would have passed, or maybe one and a half of them would have passed. What's the status right now?
So now they pulled everything back, and that's a good sign. We actually did a call to action, and thank you to everybody who responded to that. We were not alone. I mean, there was a lot of action. I talked to some congressional offices last week, and they said it's virtually all opposition communication, very little communication coming into congressional offices saying, hey, do this $3.5 trillion. And our concern was both the idea of ongoing spending at that level, but how they were proposing and paying for it, which was mainly aimed at small businesses under the guise of wealthy, but really going after those who have pass-through entities where the business income shows up on their personal tax return. So what ended up happening, though, was in the Senate, where it's a 50-50 split, and the vice president, who is Joe Biden's vice president, so obviously the tiebreaker goes to the Democrats. They have two senators that wouldn't support $3.5 trillion. And we had this weird scenario that carried out where it was like, there's a big bipartisan consensus around a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, more on the things that we would traditionally consider infrastructure. Roads and bridges, but also water and sewer and airports, rail lines, and that type of infrastructure. And then so 1.2 trillion. And then what the more liberal wing in Congress said was, we will not support spending unless you approve spending. And it was this weird thing. It was like, well, I don't know, if we approve higher spending, maybe we can leverage that to get more spending. It was like, it's not how it usually works. Like this whole idea of just stacking up spending on spending. Spend this, well, you can't spend that unless let me spend that, and the numbers got kind of ridiculous. But and we've lost sense of what trillions of dollars are, and so the two Democrats that had pulled off that package and said we're just not going to support it, it created a dynamic where they had to just cool it and pull everything back. Now that's a victory in one sense, because nothing happened right straight away. But Senator Manchin did say that 1.5 trillion is what he would be willing to accept, in addition to the 1.2 trillion in traditional infrastructure spending. So 1.5 trillion. The danger in that, though, is 1.5 trillion in ongoing spending. So 1.5 trillion every single year. That's what they're talking about, not just COVID response stuff, which is one and done. And so it's an expansion of social services at a time. Naturally, many of our members are very concerned about this because we're already having a hard time, a shortage in people available for work. So if you do things that make it easier for people to not work, then it will naturally exacerbate that problem. More federal spending means more inflation likely in our future. So they're going to they took it all off the table, and now there's going to be a quiet negotiation with no deadline. And so it's harder to mobilize. Think about it. We had 28,600 members, and we just mobilized and had thousands of communications go into Congress. It made a big difference, but they had a deadline, and it was all up, and it was like, mobilize and go impact it. Now they're going out of the public eye, and they're going to try to work out a deal where, Manchin says 1.5 trillion, Biden says, 1.9, it'll be like 1.999, like make a deal, 1.9 trillion. So that's where the negotiation is, and it will happen in a way that it won't be on the news all the time. There won't be this big deadline. It'll be hard to mobilize against. So there are risks out there, not just because of the spending, but also because of how they're proposing to pay for the spending.
Yeah, we've heard the narrative that it's paid for. It's no cost. It's free. There's something a little ominous about the fact that the IRS is in the process of hiring thousands of auditors, and if the Build Back Better were to pass, there's billions in that for the IRS. What do you suppose that all means for small business?
There are so many different areas in tax policy that we find problematic in this. So there's capital gains, there's the inheritance tax, the idea that over 40% of the value would have to be paid to the IRS when you pass the business along to this next generation. So there's those problems. But then in addition to it, remember, we also talked about the idea of every transaction being reported into the IRS for any bank account that has an average balance of over $600. And they said that they would collect $460 billion in additional taxes if that were done. And then also the kicker is that the IRS is hiring 2,500. They're in the process. I mean, this was announced a few months ago, but they're hiring 2,500 new auditors, 500 for the criminal division, and 2,000 to go out and collect more taxes. And most of those 2,000 are in the IRS's small business division. Small business division is not my term of art. That's what they call it, their small business division. If you look at the press release, though, that they put out about all these auditors that they are hiring, they said I think maybe I wrote down I guess I didn't write it down, but they said in the press release it was to go after wealthy individuals who are not paying their taxes. But the auditors are not being hired in a wealthy division or whatever. They're hiring the small business division. And this is a constant place where we have to educate the people in government, is that just because the business income flows through to the personal tax return, it makes business owners look wealthy on paper, but that doesn't mean that money was paid out of the business to the business owner. Most of the time, business owners have to reinvest most of their revenue into the business, hiring other people, investing in equipment, and all the things that have to happen in order to run a business. But the government people just can't understand that, and they'll just see a number that looks big to them, that looks wealthy to them, and that's what they want to go after. So they're hiring these auditors to audit small businesses. That's the division in the IRS where the majority of these new hires are going.
Well, that is in, as you just said, 2,500 new auditors prior to the Build Back Better, but there's an ominous investment in the IRS in Build Back Better. Speaking of that, the president actually is going to be in Michigan tomorrow to rally support for the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better. As far as we know, he's in Howell tomorrow.
Yeah, so the president will be in Michigan, will be in Howell, and this will be part of a series of visits that he makes around the country. He'll probably focus more in on states that are swing states to try and shore up support in certain areas. So I don't think, for example, he'll be visiting tomorrow Alyssa Slotkin's district. I haven't heard where she stands. I don't know for sure where she stands on the 1.5 trillion, but it would stand to reason that she wouldn't, just based on her profile and how she presents, that she wouldn't just be all in on a $3.5 trillion spending package and several of the provisions inside it. So the idea that he's going not just to Michigan, a swing state, but also a swing district in a swing state. In terms of what he's doing, I wrote down a quote from the Detroit News. They had a quote from President Biden over the weekend in terms of when they talked about him coming to Michigan, and he says, "I'm going to try to sell what I think the American people will buy." That was the president's quote about what he's doing. And so I think you should expect that there'll be more language about, hey, this is going to help with healthcare, it's going to help with education. If we spend this, and they're going to call it infrastructure, because infrastructure is a word that pulls very, very high. People, especially in Michigan, when you say, do you support increased investment in infrastructure? People say, great, yes, do it. I support it, because they're thinking roads and bridges. And so in this case, I think it's important that people understand when the president talks about infrastructure, the vast majority of the spending he's talking about are social welfare programs. And that doesn't mean that social welfare is wrong or bad. I'm just saying that our traditional definition of infrastructure, that is not what they are talking about when they say federal infrastructure package. So they'll be selling that around the country, but I think they'll be using words that make it sound different than what we would traditionally think it was.
Well, let's end by coming back to Michigan. The new Michigan, the state of Michigan's budget has a fairly significant increase and continuation of funding of the Pure Michigan campaign. There is some change afoot in Pure Michigan campaign at a time when it's certainly going to be necessary for the hospitality industry.
Pure Michigan is one of these, one of the line items that we've always supported in terms of the branding and telling the Michigan story, and it's important, and also for tourism and so many in the hospitality business the hospitality industry is made up of so many small businesses. So the Pure Michigan brand has been built and managed by a company called McCann Erickson for the last 10 plus years. So ever since it's been in existence. So they just went out to bid, and it was kind of a surprise that they changed that the strategic fund, which is like the purse strings behind the MEDC. The strategic fund board actually approved a different vendor to handle it going forward. So it's called MMGY Global. It is a Michigan company. So McCann Erickson has a presence in Michigan, but I think they're headquartered actually in New York. And so whether or not that means there's going to be a different look or feel to the Pure Michigan campaign, I don't know. But the fact that this is the voice of Michigan across the country, and for the first time since Pure Michigan has been in place, the Pure Michigan brand has been in place. there'll be a new company that is managing it. So big change up there. No reason to think it won't be as good, or maybe it'll be better. I mean, after 10 years, it's probably time to put fresh eyes on it and imagine what it could be in the future.
So changes coming. We'll be interested to see what that means. All right, that's what we have for you today. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back here Thursday at 3 o'clock. Hope you can join us then, and maybe we'll be back live on Facebook at the time. See you on Thursday.
See you on Thursday, everybody.